Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Erin Kelly about theories of justification of punishment and some challenges for those theories, and we also ask her about moving from retributive to restorative justice.
Thanks for listening. All right. I'm happy to introduce Erin Kelly, Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University. Erin's research interests are in moral and political philosophy and the philosophy of law, with a focus on questions about justice. She is incredibly prolific, and many of her articles and book projects will be of interest to our listeners. But one that we're going to ask her some specific questions about in this interview is her book, The Limits of Blame, Rethinking Punishment and Responsibility, published by Harvard University Press in 2018. That book is part of an emphasis in Erin's work on criminal law, moral responsibility, and desert, and theories of punishment, too. And we'll focus on issues related to theories of punishment today. Thanks so much for joining us, Erin. Could you start by telling us and our audience a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on these issues related to moral responsibility and the law?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah,
So I'm a professor at Tufts, where I've been working in philosophy for many years. And my interest in free will comes from really a long-standing interest broadly in ethics, responsibility, and, if you will, the meaning of life.
Mm-hmm.
I think an understanding of these topics one that appeals to me, and granted, it's just one perspective among other possibilities, connects with the idea of freedom. In order to be an ethical agent, to be responsible for one's actions, and to express one's autonomy in a meaningful way, one needs some version of a free will. Mm-hmm. And this leads to difficult questions, philosophical questions about the kind of freedom we have or should want. And it can also raise skeptical doubts about whether we have the kind of freedom we count on having. And I take this skepticism seriously because there just seems to be so much that undercuts individual autonomy, basically all the causes that influence our choices. Mm-hmm. And I've been especially interested in the social and institutional causes of behavior because these causes are themselves shaped by human choices. And that leads me to think that they could be different. Mm-hmm. So that links the topic of free will to questions of political philosophy. And political philosophy, as I think of it, is concerned to discover principles of justice that we could use to evaluate our institutions. So it concerns an important context of individual choices. So to my mind, the problem of free will is really a broad, deep, fascinating, and important topic from a philosophical, political, and existential point of view.
Yeah, agreed. Mm-hmm. You've written extensively on criminal law, and there are many philosophical issues one could explore in the criminal law, but you've also written about free will and criminal law in particular. For example, your chapter in the Routledge Companion to Free Will. Could you explain how you see the issue of free will arising in criminal law in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, I'd be happy to try. So questions of free will arise in connection with the criminal law because of the relevance of social and institutional context to the explanation of human behavior, especially crime. So this influence of social and institutional context on individual choices should, I think, bear on our thinking about the distribution of responsibility. But criminal law doesn't really take up this distributive question about how responsibility can be shared by members of society. It's very individualistic. So the focus of criminal law is individual conduct, especially wrongdoing, criminal wrongdoing. And of course, there are mental state aspects of criminal conduct, but they don't go very far to address skeptical questions about the limits of individual autonomy. Individual freedom is pretty much taken for granted by the criminal law. And I think this leads to some distortions because the distribution of responsibility, as I was just calling it, for wrongdoing is broader than acts of individual will. Individuals make choices in response to their life situations, which are conditioned by factors beyond their control. So in a society like the United States, which is rife with social inequality as well as poverty and deprivation of opportunity among the least well-off, some people make criminal choices under life circumstances that are burdened with significant injustices. And the criminal justice system creates no room to consider this. Our punishment system really does not take the social context of individual behavior into account. So matters of collective responsibility, as we might call it, for background injustice simply aren't relevant to the criminal punishment system, but they are ethically relevant. We should care about them from an ethical perspective. Social injustice limits individual freedom in some real and meaningful ways. Some people are deprived of a reasonable menu of life choices, and this is a problem in just so many ways. And I think it's something the criminal justice system should reckon with, but it currently really doesn't do that except in very limited ways.
Yeah, that's helpful. In our last episode, to kind of kick off our season on free will and the law, we asked Kyle Fritz to introduce, in very broad strokes, the main theories of justification for punishment. But we wanted to make sure to give more time to that topic this season. Could you lay out what you take to be the main theories of the justification for punishment that are on offer in the literature?
Yes, the literature tends to divide the accounts of justification and punishment into two broad camps. The first is retributive. So according to retributive theories, criminal wrongdoers deserve punishment. And more specifically, what they deserve is punishment that's proportionate to their culpable wrongdoing. Okay, it's a complex notion. We have to unpack what culpability is and wrongdoing is, what counts as proportionality. But the basic idea is that criminal wrongdoers deserve punishment that's proportionate to their culpable wrongdoing. And we can see from that retributivism is a theory that equates punishment with justice, or justice with punishment. The other camp of theories is a group of consequence-oriented theories or outcome-oriented theories. What good does punishment do for society? These theories are often described as utilitarian, but I think that designation is too narrow because the socially beneficial consequences don't have to be maximizing in the way that the utilitarian theory advocates. So we could call the non-retributive approach one that's focused on harm reduction. That's the way I like to think about it. It has certain goals, harm reduction goals. So the goals are crime prevention, crime reduction, and to some extent, redress for wrongdoing. And I think we can think about this enterprise in terms of concepts like deterrence, much discussed in the literature, incapacitation of, dangerous individuals, rehabilitation, redress to some extent, and reconciliation could be also a goal. So this broad non-retributive approach to criminal justice encompasses many goals that extend beyond and might not even include punishment. So it's a theory of punishment that opens the door for thinking beyond punishment, I think. But what unifies this broad set of approaches is the rejection of the basic principle that criminal wrongdoers deserve punishment. And that idea is not accepted by the non-retributivist camp as a fundamental moral truth.
Yeah. So what are some of the potential challenges that each of these theories faces?
Good question. Challenges definitely for both sides. I think a problem for the retributive theory concerns the limits of individual responsibility, the sorts of things I was talking about a few minutes ago, all the ways in which individual autonomy is undercut by an array of causes that influence our choices, making it hard to isolate the basis of the claim of individual desert. I think that the retributive theory also faces the difficulty of justifying its central idea, namely that a setback, some kind of harm or suffering, is what an offender deserves. It's, I think, hard to justify this idea, And many retributivists have tried to advance convincing arguments that I think fall short. And others simply accept this idea, the retributive concept, as a kind of bedrock of their view. And they try to justify it more indirectly by talking about the important moral ideas or practices that they take to depend on the retributive idea. But I haven't found that approach to be very convincing. Mm-hmm. So shifting to the other set of views, I think the problem for the harm reduction approach is how to formulate a plausible notion of accountability. What does accountability mean if it's not about deservingness of punishment? How do we think about accountability in a forward-moving way? And restorative justice offers one paradigm, one type of answer, according to which accountability is something a wrongdoer can do. A person who's caused harm can take responsibility for it by doing something to set things right, or by doing something to set things as close to right as possible. And that person can try to repair the harm that he or she has caused. And that's a non-retributive notion of accountability. It's not about deserving punishment, right, but about taking reparative action. And maybe it's about being morally obligated to take reparative action. A challenge for the harm reduction approach is also what replaces the symbolic role of punishment in society, namely punishment as a symbol of the state's repudiation of the crime, mm-hmm, and of the state's effort to vindicate the victim's rights. So if we don't symbolize the public's values and commitments through the imposition of punishment, how are we going to do it? Mm-hmm. How does the public express that it is committed to making things right? That's a challenge for non-retributive accounts. The public must clearly say no to certain kinds of behavior, and punishing is one way to do that. Helping a wrongdoer to make things right is another way, but it's more subtle and might in some ways seem to be less satisfying.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Well, you've already started to talk a little bit about the notion of restorative justice, and we want to start to ask some questions about that. But first, I wanted to mention that in your book, The Limits of Blame, you argue that our current practices of blaming criminal offenders involves a desire for retribution. Could you give some examples of what you have in mind here of particular cases?
Yes. Public expression of blame in the American criminal justice system is punishment. As I see it, punishment expresses retributive blame. It's equated with retributive justice. And the public's response to social problems that are not resolved, especially violence, seems to be to call for more punishment. This is not going to work because the underlying problems, pressing individual needs and community needs, are not being addressed. We're not doing anything to address those problems. We're punishing instead. This isn't justice, retributive or otherwise, but it's emotionally appealing as a response to social injustice and the problems that those problems give rise to. It's appealing as a response to social injustice and the problems it gives rise to. We'd like to think someone is to blame and that punishment achieves justice, but it doesn't, in my opinion. The death penalty is another blaming practice that can only be viewed as retributive. It's not plausible to think that the death penalty is necessary in order to protect society. Mm-hmm. The death penalty is a form of retributive condemnation and punishment, and people who support it do so from a desire for retribution. Otherwise, it makes no sense.
What do you see as the more just alternatives to these retributive blaming practices?
I don't have a complete answer to that question, but I have become interested in restorative justice as an alternative, non-retributive response to criminal wrongdoing. And so I can talk just a little bit about that. Restorative justice involves a conference between a responsible party, as the practitioners like to refer to the offender, and the impacted party, the way in which they describe the victim. So at the conference, the involved parties make an agreement about what the responsible party can do to make things better. Making things better takes work that often involves the community, but it can be transformative for all people involved. So restorative justice isn't a complete answer to our problems, and the practice of restorative justice is still being worked out. In some cases, it's joined with the criminal justice system and involves the cooperation of the district attorney and police. In other cases, it's a kind of community-based approach to justice that steers clear of the criminal justice system. I think in various forms it's worth exploring as a constructive alternative to a more punitive approach, and that it might end up shifting our thinking about what counts as justice. And I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Feel free to elaborate more on your views on these issues if you'd like. But we also wanted to ask if there were any kind of common responses, especially objections that you hear when you talk about your views on these issues, and whether you see any as kind of an especially pressing challenge, and how you would address those.
Yeah, I'm still thinking, my way through some of the serious challenges to turning to restorative justice and exploring it as an alternative, both its potential and its limitations. I think that the personal and confidential nature of the restorative justice dialogue has limitations. The conference is usually treated as confidential. What's said there, and even the content of the agreement, isn't publicly shared. So it's really different from a public criminal conviction or criminal trial where the records are open to view.
Right.
The proposed solution is publicly, certified. And I think the public nature of criminal trials, at least in theory, is important. There actually aren't that many criminal trials in relation to the number of criminal convictions, because most criminal convictions are obtained through a process of plea bargaining,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't involve a trial and is not much more public than restorative justice. So
Right.
in that sense, the shortcoming is not that different from the shortcomings of our current system. But I think it's something to think about. What is the public's interest here? What's the importance of the public trial or something akin to it?
Mm-hmm.
I also think that sometimes incarceration is necessary to protect the public, in extreme cases, and so the use of incarceration goes beyond what is involved in restorative justice, although it can be combined with it in ways. It involves elements of harm reduction and the use of coercion. It's not as voluntary as the restorative justice process and
Right.
conversation is. So, restorative justice, I think, needs to be part of a larger approach to justice that includes a public element. And I'm still trying to think my way through, what that should look like in contrast to what we've got now. I think there's a lot to be done in order to sort through the details of a viable alternative to the present punishment system.
Can you give us a concrete example of an ideal situation where restorative justice takes place?
Well, let me say that the typical scenario in which restorative justice is used tends to be lower level offenses and also to concentrate on juvenile offenders. There's some good reasons for that. Victims are often more willing to have their cases diverted into a restorative justice track if the harm done is not very severe.
Mm-hmm.
And also, young people, teenagers, are so unformed. Many people share the notion that these young folks need some guidance and a second chance, and to develop their skills, and that restorative justice may help people to develop social skills and and judgment in ways that will be very helpful for a socially productive future. So that's kind of the current in the practice of restorative justice, but I'm very drawn to it as a possible response to serious crimes as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there are more examples of the use of restorative justice in response to violent crimes, even extremely violent situations of mass violence in other countries. For example, Rwanda is a country that experienced a genocide. That genocide overwhelmed its criminal justice system, and they needed to find a way to deal with some of these perpetrators. They literally didn't have more room for them in the prisons. And so they went to a community justice process and approach that involved a kind of truth and reconciliation philosophy. And it has been very helpful for some people. I think, we don't yet quite know what the longer term impact is, and it's hard to say how broadly shared the positive experience of restorative justice is. But I've been working on a research project that has involved interviewing genocide survivors in Rwanda about their restorative justice experience, and they have had a lot of interesting things to say about how helpful it's been to them. I mean, these are people on the victim side, and their families were killed, and they were so filled with just rage and grief that they came to restorative justice as something that they needed in order to think about the future in a more hopeful way. So they did it for themselves, not to benefit the responsible parties, although it did benefit them, and they formed relationships with them, and it's kind of incredible, to hear them talk about it. And it's very moving. And there are stories also in the United States about people whose family members were killed and decided to take a restorative justice approach to build a relationship with the responsible parties. And it's very moving to hear people talk about what it's done for them. So I don't think that we should underestimate the value of restorative justice for healing on both sides, both those who have lost and suffered because of the crimes other people have committed against them, and those who have done terrible things, sometimes because terrible things were done to them, and their own choices were bound up in their own trauma and struggles and led to further trauma. So we're talking about layers of hurt and people trying to work together to address it, out of a real need, and a need that's become apparent from the fact that our current punishment system is not addressing it.
Right.
What's the goal for the research project with collecting the stories from Rwanda? Are you going to publish that in a book, or what's your plan?
I hope to do that. So there are various aspects of the project. I'm collaborating with a researcher who's an expert in human development. So he's coming from the social science side. So part of the project is to design some social science studies, part of which we've done already, but we would like to continue in order to think more about the impact of restorative justice, people's efforts at restorative justice. And after interviewing these Rwandan community leaders, we decided to team up with them and ask them what they wanted to see happen with their stories and how we could work together. So the research that we plan to do in the future will involve them and will be directed by their interests and their community work, and we'll work with them to study it and its impact and its potential. They also said they wanted to tell their stories in more detail as a book, and those stories could be told together with the stories of the people who injured them, the perpetrators of violence against them. And I've been involved over the past few years. Excuse me. Over the past few years, I got involved in a storytelling project with an artist named Winfred Rembert here in the United States. He's since passed away, but we wrote a book together. It was his memoir about his experience in the Jim Crow South and some of the difficulties he had with Southwest Georgia, rural town, and the hardship of his life under Jim Crow, which led him both to get involved in the civil rights movement and then to be incarcerated in Georgia for several years. And ultimately, he became an artist using these leather tooling skills that he had learned in prison. And he wanted to tell his story about his early life in Georgia and how he decided to become an artist later in his life, and about the stories behind his works of art. So we collaborated on that and wrote this book called Chasing Me to My Grave, an artist's memoir of the Jim Crow South, which was published in 2021 and actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 2022, which was super exciting.
That's great.
And it got me interested in storytelling,
Right.
in collaborating with people who want to tell their stories, who could use the help of a writer, and in telling their stories in the way that they want them to be told, very closely in collaboration. With Winfred, it involved a lot of out loud reading and talking together, many, many hours of conversation.
Yeah.
So I think these Rwandans, they got interested in the possibility of doing a storytelling project together with me, a kind of memoir. It would be more collective now. We'd have several voices and would include not only them, but the people that they've reconciled with, who had harmed them so deeply. So that's another aspect of the project. And then we also want to make a movie. So we're just going for many dimensions of what this could be.
That's great.
Yeah, this makes me want to ask a meta philosophical question about the role of stories. So as philosophers, we tend to focus so much on arguments, and a lot of times stories work so much better as a means of convincing somebody of a conclusion than an argument ever could.
Yeah, it's a good point. It can be very impactful. I agree. And sometimes hearing people's stories and kind of thinking through their stories can also help to crystallize some of the ethical issues that we gain a partial understanding of through abstract thought, but need to struggle with in concrete ways as well, I think. And for me, my work has moved in the direction of thinking about how the criminal justice system operates, how to think about ethical issues and problems in the context of our real world society and its problems. And so thinking about people's life experience and how they view their own experiences has been very helpful for thinking about and approaching some of those ethical issues and taking them seriously. So I think you're right. It can really be impactful, but it can also be intellectually stimulating and philosophically deep to think about a person's life experience and then face the challenge of how to generalize from it what can be learned that might be useful to others.
Yeah, totally.
That's great. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much again for joining us, Erin. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, I have a website, erinikkelly.com. I put my publications there and kind of keep track of my recent activities. People can also reach me through Tufts University Philosophy Department if they want to contact me. But I try to keep my website up to date, just sharing the things that I'm working on and the events I'm participating in.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great talking to you.
Yeah. In our next episode, we'll talk about mens rea, and our guest will be Craig Aguil, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Rutgers Camden.